Hi, welcome. I personally wrote and created this original story for this channel. It's a story told with care, depth, and real emotion. I'll let it unfold.
At our 25-year vow renewal, Edward told 50 guests, "Our fresh start, a clean slate ahead." Cheers swelled. Then he leaned in. "Not for you, Rebecca. The debts stay with you. I'm starting over." 50 pairs of eyes froze on me. But he had no clue about my secret. 5 years building a $500,000 online consulting empire in silence. Holding his hidden debt records and my contracts, I smiled. "Enjoy your fresh start alone." I walked out reborn. He lost everything. My name is Rebecca Sloan. I'm 46 years old. If you're drawn to stories of quiet strength and elegant justice, subscribe now and stay with me. Because what looks like silence is often strategy. I am telling this story 2 years later, from a calm apartment filled with morning light and the steady hum of a life I built myself. Back then, before everything cracked open, I was known as Edward Baxter's wife. I wore neutral colors, listened more than I spoke, and made myself useful without ever becoming visible. At 46, I had mastered the art of being underestimated. I smelled of lavender soap and fresh linen, carried leather-bound notebooks, and moved through rooms without disturbing the air. People assumed that meant I was small. They were wrong. Silence had been my training ground, and patience my sharpest instrument. For 25 years, Edward and I lived inside what looked like a perfect marriage. Our home in Connecticut had wide windows, polished wood floors, and framed photos that told a curated story. Anniversaries, holidays, carefully chosen smiles. Friends envied our consistency. Neighbors praised our longevity. Even I believed in it once. The idea that stability itself was love. Edward was charismatic in public, generous with compliments for everyone except me. In private, he was restless, distracted, always scanning for the next thrill, the next promise of more. I mistook that hunger for ambition. I told myself that long marriages evolved, that quiet was normal, that discomfort was the price of endurance. There were moments, early on, when the illusion shimmered beautifully. Our wedding day replayed itself in my mind often. The weight of silk on my shoulders, the smell of peonies, Edward's confident smile as he said my name like a pledge. We promised partnership, resilience, growth. For years, we played our parts well. I supported his career, smoothed his failures, absorbed his silences. When he grew distant, I leaned inward, telling myself that devotion was proven by patience. What I didn't realize then was that patience, unguarded, can become permission. The first cracks were subtle, almost elegant in their disguise. A credit card statement that arrived late. A casual joke about being down this month. A glance that lingered too long on his phone, followed by a quick lock of the screen. Edward began speaking in abstractions, risk, timing, opportunity, without specifics. He grew defensive when I asked practical questions. "You worry too much," he'd say, smiling like a teacher correcting a child. I learned to nod, to step back, to let the conversation die. Each small dismissal trained me to retreat further into myself, where observation sharpened into awareness. What Edward never noticed was how my retreat became expansion. While he assumed I was shrinking, I was building internal scaffolding. I listened carefully to how money moved through our household, to the rhythms of his moods, to the gaps between what he said and what he did. I noted the nights he came home buzzing with energy and the mornings he avoided eye contact. I cataloged everything, quietly, without accusation. To him, I was still the agreeable wife. To myself, I was becoming something else entirely, a woman who watched, learned, and prepared. By the time he suggested renewing our vows, I already sensed the ceremony wasn't about us. It was about image, about control, about crafting a narrative where he stood renewed and unburdened. He spoke of it as a fresh chapter, his favorite phrase. I smiled and agreed, playing my role flawlessly. I helped choose the venue, approved the guest list, selected the music. I wore elegance like armor. Inside, though, something cold and precise was forming. I didn't yet know the exact shape of the betrayal, but I felt its outline pressing against the walls of my life. On quiet afternoons, while Edward chased his distractions, I sat at my desk with tea growing cold beside me, staring at my reflection in the darkened screen of my laptop. I asked myself questions I had avoided for decades. Who would I be if I were no one's wife? What did I know that others didn't? What had I built that no one could take from me? The answers were there, steady and undeniable, waiting for the right moment. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was alert. And as the date of the vow renewal approached, I understood with absolute clarity that the woman Edward planned to humiliate no longer existed. The night before the ceremony, I stood alone in our bedroom, my dress hanging nearby, the house silent except for the ticking clock. I felt no panic, only a controlled anticipation, like the pause before a door finally opens. Edward slept soundly, convinced of his own narrative, unaware that every story has two authors, and that mine was about to begin rewriting everything he thought he owned. I used to believe greed announced itself loudly, with grand gestures and obvious demands. I was wrong. With Edward, it arrived softly, dressed as charm, wrapped in reasonable explanations. Looking back now, 2 years later, I can trace the precise moment when his relationship with money shifted from ambition into something darker. It was not a crisis, not a confession, but a subtle change in temperature, like realizing the room has gone cold long after the window was opened. If you're listening closely to this story, take a second now to subscribe, because what begins as nothing is often the most dangerous beginning of all. It started with absences. Edward was physically present, yet mentally elsewhere, his thoughts constantly drifting toward unseen calculations. He spoke in fragments at dinner, eyes flicking toward his phone even when it lay face down on the table. When I asked about his day, he answered vaguely, as if details had become liabilities. "Markets are weird right now," he'd say. Or, "I'm just restructuring some things." The language of concealment is always imprecise. I noticed how often he used words like temporary, soon, handled. They were verbal bandages meant to stop questions before they formed. Money, once a practical topic between us, became emotional territory he guarded fiercely. If I mentioned budgeting or long-term planning, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd laugh it off, pat my hand, tell me I worried too much. There was a new edge beneath the reassurance, a faint irritation that hadn't been there before. It fascinated me how quickly affection turned into dismissal. The shift was small enough that anyone else might have missed it, but I had spent 25 years learning Edward's rhythms. I could hear the discord even when the melody sounded the same. The tangible signs came later, disguised as inconveniences. A utilities bill paid late, a credit card alert explained away as a system glitch. He began insisting on handling finances to spare me stress, framing his control as kindness. I agreed without protest. That was my advantage. People reveal far more when they believe they are unobserved. I watched him create distance between me and information, then justify that distance with concern. It was almost elegant in its manipulation, almost impressive, but what impressed me more was how unnecessary it was. He underestimated how much I understood simply by paying attention. Edward's mood swings grew sharper. Wins, whatever they were, made him euphoric. Restless energy, loud laughter, sudden generosity toward strangers. Losses plunged him into silence. He would pace the house at night, footsteps measured but relentless, the floorboards memorizing his anxiety. When I asked what kept him awake, he'd smile thinly and say, "Just thinking ahead." That phrase became his shield. Thinking ahead, to him, meant chasing the next risk that promised relief from the last one. I didn't yet know the word gambling belonged in that sentence, but I felt the spiral forming beneath it. Socially, he became performative about success. Edward started dropping casual hints at gatherings, implying investments, connections, opportunities just beyond reach. He loved the way people leaned in when money was mentioned, the way admiration flickered across their faces. Yet behind closed doors, he was tightening, coiling inward. Confidence on display often hides desperation underneath. I saw it in how he measured his worth against other men, how he bristled at stories of quiet stability. He wanted acceleration, not growth. He wanted to leap, not build. I began to understand that Edward wasn't just spending money, he was spending certainty. Every choice he made traded long-term safety for the brief intoxication of possibility. And the more uncertain things became, the more he clung to the illusion of control. That illusion required someone else to carry the weight of reality. Quietly, invisibly, that someone was me. I was the constant he leaned on without acknowledging, the ground beneath his feet that he assumed would always be there. He never asked if I agreed to that role. He simply took it. What startled me most was not his behavior, but how entitled it felt. Edward acted as though partnership meant insulation, that my presence absolved him of consequences. He joked once, half serious, that I was good at holding things together. I smiled, as expected. Inside, I translated the statement accurately. You will absorb this. That was the moment I stopped interpreting his actions generously. Love does not require one person to quietly shoulder another's recklessness. From that day on, I watched him not as a wife, but as a strategist studying risk. The vow renewal planning accelerated his unraveling. The event became a stage on which he rehearsed a future that no longer included shared responsibility. He spoke often of clean slates and fresh starts, language that subtly positioned me as part of the old structure, useful but replaceable. I realized then that his debts were not just financial. They were moral, relational, and deeply personal. And like all debts, they demanded payment. The only question was who he intended to hand the bill to. One evening, as Edward showered, his phone buzzed on the dresser. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The notification banner alone told me enough. Numbers, urgency, a name I didn't recognize paired with a familiar financial app icon. My pulse remained steady. This was no longer suspicion. It was confirmation that something significant lay beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. I folded the information into myself like a sealed envelope, knowing that when I finally opened it, nothing between us would ever look the same again. I never planned to build an empire. That's the part people misunderstand when they hear this story now, framed as triumph. 5 years ago, I wasn't dreaming of revenue charts or scaling funnels or becoming a quiet force for women over 40. I was simply trying to breathe. Edward's restlessness had begun to press against the walls of our marriage, and I needed a space where his moods could not reach me, a space that belonged only to me. If this resonates with you, if you've ever rebuilt yourself in silence, subscribe and stay, because this chapter is where invisibility becomes leverage. The idea arrived the way most real transformations do, disguised as survival. I had spent decades listening, to clients at Edward's office parties, to women in waiting rooms, to friends whispering regrets over coffee. Again and again, I heard the same fear repeated in different accents. What happens to us after 40? Careers stalled, marriages shifted, confidence thinned. The world spoke loudly about reinvention for the young, but offered very little guidance for women who had already given their best years to everyone else. I recognized that fear intimately. I was living inside it, and recognition, when combined with discipline, is the seed of expertise. I started small, almost invisibly. Late mornings after Edward left the house, I opened my laptop and began outlining thoughts. No branding, no audience, no ambition beyond clarity. I wrote about decision fatigue, about being underestimated, about the quiet grief of disappearing inside a long marriage. I studied digital platforms the way other people study languages, patiently, methodically. I learned how women searched for answers online, what words they trusted, what promises felt false. I did this without announcing anything to anyone. Silence wasn't secrecy, it was protection. What is unnamed cannot be attacked. My first clients came through referrals I didn't advertise. A woman from Massachusetts who felt obsolete at 52. A divorced executive in Rhode Island terrified of starting over. I charged modestly, not because I undervalued myself, but because I was building proof. Every session sharpened my understanding. Patterns emerged. Women didn't need motivation. They needed frameworks. They needed language for boundaries. They needed someone who didn't speak down to them or rush them toward reinvention like it was a cosmetic upgrade. I gave them structure, dignity, and patience, things I myself was learning to reclaim. Edward never noticed the shift in me, and that was the most revealing part. While I was refining systems, he was chasing adrenaline. While I was documenting processes, he was avoiding consequences. I learned to compartmentalize completely. My consulting work lived in encrypted folders, separate accounts, neutral file names. Not because I was hiding wrongdoing, but because autonomy requires privacy. I told Edward I was doing some freelance writing. He nodded, uninterested. His lack of curiosity was my greatest advantage. He never asked how much I earned. He never wondered why I seemed calmer. To him, I was background noise. By the third year, the numbers had become undeniable. What began as modest monthly income stabilized into something powerful. 5 figures, then consistent growth. 1,000 women across the country enrolled in my programs over time. I refined my offerings into clear tiers, built community spaces, documented success stories without exposing identities. I did everything ethically, quietly, and deliberately. $500,000 a year doesn't arrive by accident. It arrives through repetition, trust, and relentless self-respect. I felt myself expanding internally, even as my external life remained deliberately modest. Ruth Callahan entered my life during this period like a lighthouse, steady, experienced, unthreatened by other women's competence. She was 60, sharp-eyed, and unromantic about success. Ruth didn't flatter me. She evaluated me. She saw the structure beneath my gentleness and named it without apology. "You're not helping women," she said once. "You're preparing them." That distinction mattered. Ruth taught me how to protect my intellectual property, how to formalize contracts, how to prepare for the moment when success attracts attention. She never asked about Edward. She understood instinctively that some things grow best without witnesses. What I didn't anticipate was how my inner transformation would make Edward's behavior look increasingly grotesque by contrast. His bravado began to feel juvenile. His risks seemed reckless rather than bold. While I calculated sustainability, he chased escape. I wasn't angry yet. I was observant. I understood something essential that many people miss. Power does not announce itself. It accumulates. And by the time it is visible, it is already too late to stop. I had built something Edward could neither access nor control, and he had no idea. The strangest part was how peaceful I felt. Not euphoric, not vengeful, peaceful. My mornings had structure. My work had meaning. My income had independence. I was no longer emotionally dependent on Edward's approval or stability. I could leave, and that knowledge alone changed how I moved through the world. I wasn't planning an exit yet. I was planning resilience. And resilience, once established, makes betrayal survivable. The night Edward rehearsed his fresh start speech aloud in the living room, testing lines he would later use in front of 50 guests, I sat across from him, nodding politely. Inside, I felt a quiet certainty settle into place. Whatever he believed this renewal represented, it was not a beginning. It was a reveal. And the woman he thought he was discarding had already outgrown the life he was trying to abandon. The venue was designed to glow at dusk, all warm stone and glass, catching the last gold of the evening, a place chosen to make people believe in renewal. Candles lined the path like quiet witnesses, their flames steady despite the breeze coming off the water. I arrived early, as I always did, wearing a dress that fell cleanly against my body, neither flashy nor apologetic. It was the color of restraint, soft ivory with a subtle sheen that caught light only when I moved. If you're still with me, subscribe now, because this is the moment when public smiles become private weapons, and the truth finally steps onto the stage. 50 guests gathered with practiced cheer, voices overlapping, laughter blooming and fading like waves. Friends we had known for decades hugged me, told me how beautiful everything looked, how inspiring it was to see a marriage last 25 years. I thanked them gently, absorbing their warmth without leaning on it. The air smelled of citrus and polished wood, and somewhere a string quartet rehearsed a melody meant to suggest hope. Edward moved through the crowd like a host who owned the future. Handshakes firm, jokes well-timed, confidence sharpened by performance. He barely looked at me, not out of cruelty, but certainty. He believed the night belonged to him. When the ceremony began, the light shifted. The room dimmed just enough to make the candles feel intimate, intentional. We stood facing each other as we had once before, years ago, though now the distance between us felt vast and ceremonial. Edward smiled for the audience, that familiar public smile that never reached his eyes. I met his gaze steadily, calm as stone. The officiant spoke of endurance, of partnership refined by time, of choosing one another again. The words floated beautifully, harmlessly, like petals drifting toward a place they would never land. Edward took the microphone first. His voice carried easily, practiced and smooth. He spoke about growth, about learning lessons the hard way, about fresh starts. People nodded, murmured approval. Then he delivered the line he had rehearsed, the one he believed would make him look magnanimous. "Our fresh start," he said, pausing for effect. "A clean slate ahead." Applause rose on cue, glasses lifted, smiles widened. And then, with a tilt of his head toward me, a half-smile that felt surgical, he leaned closer and lowered his voice, just enough to sound intimate while still being heard. "Not for you, Rebecca," he said. "The debts stay with you. I'm starting over." Time didn't stop. It sharpened. I felt every eye turn, every breath catch, every unspoken calculation ripple through the room. 50 pairs of eyes froze on me, searching my face for collapse, for tears, for embarrassment. The humiliation was perfectly designed, public, controlled, irreversible. Edward had chosen his audience carefully, confident that social pressure would do the rest. In that moment, he believed he had rewritten our history in one sentence, assigning me the weight he refused to carry. He thought the spectacle itself would secure his victory. What he could not see was how prepared I was. My body did not flinch. My breath remained steady. Years of invisibility had trained me for stillness under scrutiny. Inside my clutch were documents he assumed didn't exist. Summaries, contracts, quiet proof of a life he never bothered to examine. I felt no urge to defend myself. Defense implies weakness. Instead, I smiled. Not brightly, not bitterly, but with a calm that unsettled the room. The kind of smile that suggests information the other party does not possess. I stepped closer to him, close enough that only he could hear my reply. "Enjoy your fresh start alone," I said softly. There was no tremor in my voice, just clarity. I turned to the audience then, thanked them for coming, and wished them a beautiful evening. The words were polite, composed, devastating in their restraint. Murmurs spread, confusion replacing certainty. Edward stood frozen, his script suddenly useless. He had planned for tears, not dignity. He had prepared for collapse, not departure. As I walked away, heels clicking steadily against stone, I felt the room exhale behind me. No one stopped me. No one knew how. Outside, the night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of water and possibility. I didn't run. I didn't look back. Every step felt deliberate, earned. This was not an escape. It was an exit. Behind me, Edward's world had begun to tilt, though he didn't yet know how far it would fall. I reached my car and paused, hands resting on the door, allowing myself one quiet moment. Not of grief, not of anger, but of confirmation. The humiliation he intended for me had revealed him completely, to others and to himself. And somewhere between the candlelight and the cold night air, I understood that the real reckoning hadn't even started yet. It was already moving toward him, quietly, efficiently, carrying his name on every page. The morning after the vow renewal, the house felt unfamiliar, like a hotel room after checkout. Tidy, impersonal, already preparing to forget me. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted slowly, indifferent to everything that had changed. I moved quietly, deliberately, as if sound itself could interfere with precision. If you're finding strength in this unraveling, take a moment to subscribe, because this is where intuition hardens into evidence and belief finally gives way to fact. Edward slept late, exhausted by performance. I did not wake him. I didn't need confrontation. I needed confirmation. For years, he had insisted on managing finances for my peace of mind, and I had allowed it, knowing that control leaves fingerprints. On the counter sat his tablet, unlocked, abandoned with the casual arrogance of someone who believes secrecy is the same as safety. I brewed coffee, inhaled the bitter warmth, and opened the device with the calm of a woman reading a document she already understands. What I was about to find would not shock me. It would align. The shared finance app loaded first, a neat dashboard pretending to be neutral. I navigated slowly, methodically, the way Ruth had taught me. Never jump, always trace. Accounts branched into sub-accounts, labels softened by euphemism. Recreation, opportunity, short-term float. I tapped into transaction histories and felt the quiet click of recognition. Patterns appeared immediately. Late-night transfers, escalating amounts, withdrawals that spiked after weekends and holidays. The sums were not random, they were compulsive. I followed the trail backward and forward, month by month, watching $200,000 evaporate into platforms designed to promise control while delivering chaos. I took screenshots, not hurriedly, but thoroughly. Dates, times, account IDs, merchant codes. Each piece assembled itself into a narrative Edward could not rewrite. There were loans layered atop loans, interest compounding like a shadow that grows faster than its owner. I cross-referenced with bank statements and found the concealment. Payments rerouted, balances masked, alerts disabled. He hadn't merely lied. He had engineered a system to keep me uninformed. That realization landed with a clean finality. Betrayal, when proven, stops being emotional and becomes logistical. Emails filled in the gaps. I searched without guilt. Privacy dissolves when it is weaponized. There were messages from creditors with polite threats wrapped in courtesy, reminders that time was not on his side. There were internal notes Edward had written to himself, lists, strategies, affirmations that read like spells against consequence. One more win. Just need momentum. Rebecca won't ask. I closed my eyes briefly, not in pain, but in acknowledgement. He had counted on my silence. He had mistaken my composure for ignorance. I compiled everything into a dossier, the way I had learned to build frameworks for my clients. Clear, chronological, undeniable. No commentary, no emotion. Facts don't need persuasion when they are complete. I named files neutrally, exported securely, and backed them up twice. This was not revenge. This was accountability prepared with care. The discipline that built my consulting empire guided my hand now. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. I felt no rush. The truth had waited years. It could wait a few more hours. When Edward finally emerged, disheveled and defensive, I was already gone, out for a walk, phone silenced, mind clear. I needed distance to decide how the truth would move, not whether it would. Power is not exposure alone. It is timing and direction. I considered options the way a chess player considers the board several moves ahead. Direct confrontation would satisfy him. Silence would unsettle him. But structure would undo him. I returned home in the afternoon to find him pacing, rehearsing explanations he hadn't yet delivered. He spoke in half questions, testing the air for forgiveness. I listened without interruption, noted the omissions, the minimizations. When he finished, I thanked him for sharing and said nothing else. The absence of reaction unsettled him more than anger ever could. That night, while he slept poorly, I drafted a cover note, not to him, but to the institutions he owed, crafted to be anonymous, factual, and precise. I sealed the dossier digitally and paused before sending, feeling the gravity of the moment without dramatizing it. Once released, consequences would move independently of me. That is the elegance of truth when properly delivered. It requires no further participation. As my finger hovered over the button, I understood that this was the last quiet moment Edward would have for a long time. The machinery he built to hide would now begin to turn against him, efficient and indifferent. Leaving is rarely dramatic when it's done correctly. There is no slammed door, no raised voice, no final speech delivered for satisfaction. There is only alignment between decision and action, so seamless that by the time others notice, the outcome is already irreversible. If this story is resonating with you, subscribe now, because this is where silence becomes motion, and motion becomes consequence. I did not leave the house the way movies teach us to leave marriages. I did not pack hurriedly or argue logistics. I prepared. For weeks after the vow renewal, I moved through the space with deliberate normalcy, allowing Edward to believe that confusion, not strategy, governed my behavior. I cooked familiar meals. I answered messages politely. I slept lightly. Meanwhile, my life elsewhere was assembling itself with quiet efficiency. I had already secured a lease under my company's holding name, furnished simply but intentionally, chosen light over luxury. Leaving isn't about escape. It's about continuity without contamination. The morning I chose was unremarkable by design. Overcast, cool, no symbolism, no witnesses. Edward left early, already stressed by phone calls he tried unsuccessfully to disguise. I waited an hour after the door closed, then began. What I took was minimal. Clothing, personal notebooks, one framed photo I still recognized myself in. I left behind objects heavy with shared history. Possessions lose power when they no longer anchor identity. I walked through each room once, not to grieve, but to confirm completion. The house was no longer mine. I was no longer its keeper. Before I locked the door, I placed an envelope on the entry table. Inside was nothing dramatic. No accusations, no explanations. Just a single sentence, typed cleanly. Please communicate through counsel. That was all. Boundaries do not require justification. They require enforcement. I closed the door softly and felt the click of finality register not in my chest, but in my posture. I stood straighter. Breathing became easier. This was not loss. This was release. From my new apartment with its clean lines and neutral palette, I executed the next phase. The dossier was already complete. What remained was distribution. Ruth had taught me that institutions don't respond to emotion. They respond to clarity. I created a neutral email address, stripped of identifiers, and drafted messages to each creditor Edward owed. Each note followed the same structure: factual introduction, documented evidence, reference to applicable compliance requirements. No opinions, no threats. just information they were legally obligated to review. Accountability, when framed properly, becomes inevitable. I sent the first email and waited exactly 10 minutes before sending the next. Not for drama, but for tracking. Each message was logged, time-stamped, archived. I imagined the process beginning on the other end, files opening, analysts pausing, internal conversations shifting tone. Edward believed his debts were private failures. He did not understand that once documented, they became systemic concerns. Systems move faster than individuals. They do not argue. They do not forgive. They correct. Within days, the ripple effects began. Edward's calls increased in frequency, then in urgency. I did not answer. His messages shifted from confusion to indignation to fear. I read none of them. Silence is not avoidance when communication has already been redirected. Meanwhile, I focused on expansion. My consulting business, now fully autonomous, entered its most productive phase. Women sensed the shift in me even if they didn't know the reason. Authority is contagious when it's grounded. Enrollment increased. Engagement deepened. I was no longer coaching from theory. I was coaching from embodiment. What surprised me most was not his panic, but my calm. I slept through the night for the first time in years. My mornings began with intention instead of anticipation. I drank coffee slowly, answered emails deliberately, walked without scanning for emotional weather. Leaving had restored bandwidth I didn't know I'd lost. This was the real victory. Not his coming downfall, but my reclaimed attention. Power tastes like clarity. It smells like clean air. It feels like choosing yourself without apology. The final message I sent was not to a creditor, but to my attorney. It was brief, procedural, unemotional. By the time Edward realized the machinery had been activated, it was already moving beyond anyone's control, including mine. That is the myth of revenge people misunderstand. True justice does not require constant supervision. It requires correct initiation. Once set in motion, it unfolds with mechanical precision. On the evening the last email was sent, I stood by my window watching the city settle into night. Lights flickered on in distant buildings, each one representing a life unfolding independently of mine. I felt no triumph, only alignment. Edward was still unaware of how exposed he truly was, still convinced this was a temporary disruption. He had no idea that the version of me he relied on had exited quietly, and that what remained was a system he could not negotiate with, charm, or escape. Collapse rarely looks the way people imagine it. There is no single catastrophic moment, no dramatic fall captured in one perfect frame. Instead, there is acceleration, events stacking so quickly that denial has no time to catch its breath. If you're still here with me, subscribe now, because this is where systems move faster than ego. And the man who believed himself untouchable discovers how little control he ever had. Edward's unraveling began quietly, the way rot always does. At first, it was procedural. Emails marked urgent, calendar meetings suddenly rescheduled, a tone shift in conversations he tried to laugh through. He called me repeatedly, leaving messages that oscillated between irritation and disbelief. He wanted explanations, someone to blame, a way to reframe what was happening as misunderstanding. I did not listen. Silence is not cruelty when the conversation has already concluded. What Edward was experiencing was not confusion. It was exposure. Within days, the first account was frozen pending review. Edward told himself it was temporary, a clerical delay. He had built his life on the belief that problems could be talked around if one sounded confident enough. But institutions do not respond to tone. They respond to documentation. Each creditor, now armed with a complete picture, acted independently yet in unison. Requests for clarification multiplied. Deadlines tightened. The illusion of isolation, each debt hidden from the others, collapsed into a single, undeniable profile. His job noticed next. Financial compliance reviews have a way of surfacing inconvenient truths, especially when external pressure is applied. Edward had always believed his professional charm insulated him from scrutiny. It didn't. Meetings grew shorter. Conversations ended with phrases like, "We'll be in touch, and this requires review." He began dressing more carefully, speaking more carefully, as if presentation alone could slow the current pulling him under. I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with inevitability. This was the cost of building on deception. When one wall falls, the structure follows. The house was next. Mortgage inquiries, liens, calls that could no longer be ignored. Edward spent nights pacing. The same footsteps I had once memorized now echoing without an audience. He searched for allies, friends who had applauded his speech, acquaintances impressed by his confidence. Doors closed politely. People distanced themselves quickly from risk they didn't consent to. The social insulation he believed he'd earned through performance dissolved under pressure. Stability, it turns out, is not inherited from applause. I heard about his spiral through secondary channels: mutual acquaintances, professional whispers, logistical notices forwarded by counsel. I did not seek updates. They arrived anyway. Consequences are loud even when you're not listening. Edward's tone shifted in the final messages I never opened, from anger to pleading to something like recognition. Too late. Recognition after damage is simply awareness without remedy. What struck me most was how quickly everything moved once truth entered the system. Years of deception undone in weeks. That is the difference between personal narratives and institutional reality. Stories can be revised, records cannot. Edward had lived as though consequences were negotiable, as though responsibility could be deferred indefinitely. Watching that belief collapse was not satisfying. It was instructive. As his life constricted, mine expanded. My consulting platform crossed a threshold I had been preparing for quietly. Higher enrollment, deeper engagement, momentum that felt earned rather than frantic. Women didn't just want guidance. They wanted proof that reinvention was possible without spectacle. I gave them that proof simply by existing as myself, unbroken and unapologetic. Authority does not need a microphone when it is consistent. The last update I received about Edward was almost clinical. Employment terminated, property in default, restructuring underway. No drama, no villain monologue, just outcomes. I sat with that information briefly, then closed the file. His collapse was complete enough to no longer require my attention. And that, more than anything, confirmed the success of my exit. Because the true measure of victory is not how loudly the other person falls, but how completely they disappear from your decision-making. 2 years have passed since the night I walked out into cool air and left a marriage behind like a closed chapter I no longer needed to reread. Time has a way of sanding down sharp memories, not by erasing them, but by placing them in proper proportion. I no longer relive the vow renewal with heat in my chest. Instead, I remember it the way one remembers a decisive exam or a long journey's final station. Important, formative, finished. If this story has walked beside you this far, stay with me to the end, because endings, when they are earned, deserve to be understood in full. My life now is quieter in the ways that matter, and fuller in ways I never imagined while I was still negotiating my worth inside a marriage. I wake before the city fully stirs, not because I'm anxious, but because I want to. Morning light spills across clean surfaces, and the first sound I hear is my own breath, steady and unhurried. I dress without calculation, no need to anticipate another person's mood or expectations. The mirror reflects a woman who belongs to herself. At 48 now, I don't chase youth or novelty. I inhabit myself completely, and that is more powerful than reinvention ever promised to be. My work grew naturally into its next form once the noise cleared. Reinvented Women, the program I launched after leaving, was never meant to be a statement against Edward. It was a continuation of the work I had already been doing, just without fragmentation. I expanded my offerings carefully, scaling systems rather than my visibility. Within the first year, revenue crossed $1 million, not through viral theatrics, but through trust compounded over time. 1,000 women became 2, then 3. They didn't come to me for motivation. They came because I represented proof that a woman can step out of a long role without imploding, without apology, without spectacle. What surprised me was how little I needed to talk about my past. Clients would sometimes ask, gently, what pushed me to build what I had built. I never lied. I simply didn't dramatize. I reached a point where my life no longer fit, I would say. That was enough. Women understand that sentence instinctively. They recognize the moment when endurance becomes erosion. In our sessions, I didn't teach them how to leave marriages or careers. I taught them how to prepare, to build leverage quietly, to reclaim attention, to separate identity from obligation. Empowerment, I learned, is not about escape. It's about optionality. Edward faded from my life the way fog lifts, gradually, then completely. There was no final conversation, no reconciliation, no cinematic reckoning. His name stopped appearing in my thoughts because it no longer served any function there. Mutual acquaintances eventually stopped updating me. Institutions finished what they had started and moved on. I felt no need to check outcomes or tally losses. Closure does not require observation, it requires acceptance. I accepted that the man I married was not the man who could walk beside me into the life I was meant to inhabit. That understanding carried no bitterness, only accuracy. Ruth remains in my life, still sharp, still unsentimental. We meet for lunch occasionally, two women who understand systems and boundaries better than nostalgia. She once told me, over coffee, that the most dangerous thing a woman can do is confuse loyalty with self-erasure. I carry that sentence with me now, not as a warning, but as a compass. Loyalty that costs you your future is not virtue. It is surrender dressed up as love. I make different choices now, not louder ones, just clearer ones. The greatest shift, though, happened internally. I no longer measure my success by comparison or survival. I measure it by coherence. My days align with my values. My energy goes where it is respected. I no longer explain myself to people who benefit from misunderstanding me. This is the freedom that never gets advertised. The freedom of not having to prove that your leaving was justified. Justification is a tax women are taught to pay. I stopped paying it. Sometimes, late in the evening, I think about the woman I was before all of this. The one who believed that being chosen meant being secure, that longevity equaled love. I don't judge her. She did the best she could with the information she had. She learned by enduring, and endurance taught her preparation. Preparation taught her independence. Independence taught her peace. Growth is not linear, and it is rarely gentle, but it is always honest in the end. If there is a lesson here, it is not about marriage or money or even betrayal. It is about authorship. For most of my life, I allowed someone else to narrate my role. When I reclaimed that voice, quietly, patiently, everything else reorganized itself around the truth. I did not ruin a man's life. I simply stepped out of the fiction that required my silence to survive. What followed was not revenge, but reality asserting itself. My name is Rebecca Sloan. I am 48 years old now. I live a life that fits me. And if you're standing at the edge of a realization you haven't yet named, know this. You do not need permission to prepare. You only need the courage to listen when your life starts asking for something truer.